And I'm gonna do this. Gonna go here, up, 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 up.
Ooh.
Hold on. And
Oh, and Avimelech.
here we go. Okay. Okay. So in the previous shiurim, we spoke about Shaul. We spoke about Shaul a lot, and especially how uh, the text, how the book of Shmuel actually criticizes the behavior of Shaul. And we're going to continue with that a little bit. Um, I want to dedicate today's class in memory of my mom. Um, her yahrzeit is going to be this Friday, Lag BaOmer. It's going to be 10 years since she passed, and way too soon, way too young, and we miss her terribly. Okay, the interesting comparison we're going to do today is between Shaul and a character that we're not that familiar with. It's Avimelech. So we're not talking about Avimelech that appears in Sefer Bereshit, the one that Melech Sdom, the king of Sdom, that Abraham encounters, but rather we're talking about a different Melech, Avimelech, who was also a Melech. This Avimelech appears in Sefer Shoftim, in the book of Judges. And I put the story here so we can actually refresh our memory. It's actually not one of the well-known stories, and I don't think we covered that in the past. So we did speak about Gidon, one of the judges, and actually we compared him with, if you remember, both with Shaul and Yonatan in one of the previous classes. But after the story of Gidon, here's what we see in the text. You can follow in the English. ולגדעון היו 70 בנים יוצאי יריחו. Gidon had 70 sons, whatever that means, whether it's literally or not, doesn't matter. כי נשים רבות היו, because they had many wives, ופילגשו אשר בשכם ילדה לו גם היא בן, and he had a concubine, and she had a son as well. וישם את שמו אבימלך, and he named him Avimelech. Okay, so his son from the concubine, he named him Avimelech. וילך אבימלך בן ירובעל שכם ההלכי אמו, וידבר אליהם אל כל משפחת בית אבי אמו לאמור. So he went to all his brothers, and he says the following, דברו נא בעוני כל בעלי שכם, מה טוב לכם? המשול בכם 70 איש, כל בני ירובעל, אם משול בכם איש אחד. He said, we need to be together. We're one family. We got to be together. We got to stick together. And it's better one of us, one of the family, is going to be kind of in charge. We are the prominent family. Our father was the judge. We need to take leadership. And it's better that one of us is going to be the leader rather than somebody else from outside of the family. וזכרתם כי עצמכם ובשרכם אני. And I'm your brother. וידברו אחרי אמו עליו, באוזני כל בעל שכם את כל הדברים האלה. ויית ליבם אחרי אבימלך, and he was able to convince them. כי אמרו אחינו, because they said, you know what? You are our brother. Fine, we're going to support you. ויבוא בית אביו עופרתה, ויהרוג את אחיו בני ירובעל 70 איש על אבן אחת. And he is able to gather them, and what he does, when they're all together, he kills them, all 70 of them. ויוותר יותם בן ירובעל הקטון כי נחבא. Except for one brother who was still a child, Yotam, he was hiding, and he was saved. ויעשר אבימלך על ישראל 3 שנים, and he becomes the king, obviously not a king like Shaul. He was not appointed as king, but he appointed himself as a king, and not only that, he literally killed all the competition. and he becomes the king for 3 years. Of course, the troubles of the Jewish people continue, and just like skip a bunch of psukim there, and he goes into battle, and again, it's the same tactics that we have seen in the past. Shlosha Rashim, 3-head tactic, divide the force into 3 when he goes to battle. And ותשלח אישה אחת פלח רכב על ראש אבימלך, ותרץ את גולגלתו. To make a long story short, he's putting a siege on the city of Tabai, and what happens is that he's outside of the wall, and one lady from the wall drops or throws a scalp on him, and he's injured. And he says, ויקרא מהרה לנער נושא כליו, ויאמר לו, שלוף חרבך ומוטטני פן יאמרו לי, אישה הרגת הוא, וידקרהו נערו וימות. And then as the last act, he asked his servant to kill him because he doesn't want to be the one who's going to be remembered and was killed by a woman. Okay, that's the story of Avimelech. Not a very long story. Yes, Miriam? Miriam, you had a question?
Unmuted.
Yeah, I'm trying.
Okay, it's not important. I just wanted to understand what it meant by Haroget Achav B'nei Yuval Shivimish. What does Al Even Echad mean? On one
Basically
stone.
slaughter them on one rock.
On one rock.
Yeah.
What does that mean? They were all standing on one rock?
Pretty much it was well, I guess I guess he had one rock as kind of like the cutting board, if you want to call it.
So
So
they
he
were
just
all
brought them
standing.
one by one and killed them over there.
So in one place, they were standing in one place and he killed them all.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
You know how he killed them? By the sword? Is that
By
it?
the sword.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. So let's after looking at this horrible story, let's oops, I'm sorry about that. Let's what is going on here? I have some issues. Okay. Okay. Sorry about that. Let's compare Shaul and Avimelech. Both were the first kings. Avimelech appointed himself, killed the competition, but the text still call him a melech, a king. Shaul was indeed the first king. He was appointed by Shmuel, and he is indeed the legitimate king and both the first kings. So that's number one. Number two, both didn't leave an heir. Right? Shaul's children do not, Jonathan does not become the king, but rather David becomes the king. Same goes for Avimelech. He is not starting a monarchy. His son does not become the king. Both cases, we see the texts of Ruach Ra, bad spirit. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Okay? But this is the only time in the Bible where we see that term Ruach Ra. And it seems that was kind of like their default because of that Ruach Ra. When it comes to Avimelech, it says, Vayishlach Elohim Ruach Ra ben Avimelech uben Baalei Shechem vayivgedu Baalei Shechem v'Avimelech. Okay, there was some sort of a bad spirit and people started to rebel against him. And when it comes to Shaul, it says, Beruach Hashem sara me'im sholu v'yatatu ruach ra me'et Hashem. He had some sort of a bad spirit that God kind of gave him as a present. Okay? And this is the only time that we see that term, ruach ra. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. Okay, next. Both killed an entire household. In the case of Avimelech, he kills all his father's household, all of his family, all his brothers. What about the story of Shaul. We're talking about the whole city of Nov. We spoke about that event. He kills the city of Nov because he he knows that they helped David, and it's a whole city, one family, 85 Kohanim from one family, and he kills them all. Okay, so he kills an entire household. And from both cases, there was one survivor. As we mentioned, there was the younger brother that was hiding in the case of Avimelech, and he survived. And also, there was one survivor, Eviatar, that also managed to run away from Nov, and he is the survivor. And he actually is the one that ran to David and told of the story and what happened at Nov. So there was one survivor from that massacre. Both kings killed the household because of a betrayal. Shaul believed that they betrayed him, and therefore he killed the city of Nov, the people of the city of Nov. And in the case of Avimelech, he believed that also they betrayed him, the people of Shechem, and therefore he killed them all. Okay? Both said they'll benefit their relatives. In the story of Avimelech, he goes to his brothers and he says, "מה טוב לכם המשול בכם 70 איש כל בני ירובעל, אם משול בכם איש אחד, זכרתם כעצמכם ובשרם אני." It's going to be good for you if one of the family becomes the ruler. It's going to be beneficial for you. Okay? What about the story of Shaul? The story of Shaul, we see the following. ויאמר שאול לעבדיו הניצבים עליו שמעונה, בני ימיני, גם לכולכם ייתן בן ישי שדות וחמים, לכולכם ישים שרי אלפים ושרי מאות. In other words, he is saying, Shaul says, remember, I'm from your tribe. I'm Ben Ish Yemini, and I gave you all those gifts, fields and everything, and vineyards. Do you really think that David is going to do that for you? Okay, both crooked, and of course that was not a kosher act, but both did the same thing. Next point. Both were able to achieve victory in the battlefield using that tactics of the three-head. The three-head tactics, you take your force, you divide it to three centers, and you attack from three places at the same time. And they both were successful. Remember, with Shaul, it's the story of his first war against Ammon. Next, and both asked their servant to kill them in order to prevent shame. In the story of Avimelech, we just mentioned that he said, I don't want to be the one remembered that was killed by a woman. And in the case of Shaul, the pasuk says, "Vayomer Shaul enosek elav shlof chachbecha vedokreni ba." Take your sword and kill me. Pen yavohu ha'arelim ha'ele udekaruni v'it'alelu bi. He is afraid that the Plishtim are going to kill him. Not only that, they're going to abuse the body, and therefore he asked his servant to kill him as a last act. What are we supposed to learn from that? What are we supposed to learn from the fact that the text is comparing these two stories? So we could say one thing. We could say that generally, we already know that there is a negative criticism. There's a criticism on Shaul, and perhaps that's supposed to even highlight that criticism against Shaul. But the fact that all those points are limited to that act of killing the Kohanim of Nov and not his entire career, or let's call it the first period, the before period, before he fails with Agag and the Amalek, as we learned, tells me at least that the problem is, and the comparison to this terrible story of Avimelech is only the last part of his career of Shaul. If you remember in the beginning, Shaul, we see that he is kind of hesitant, somebody who can't control, doesn't have control in time of crisis. You remember the story with Shaul that he claims that he can't control the people, they're going to run away, and therefore he had no choice, and he had to bring the sacrifices, and Shmuel was not coming, blah, 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 blah. And also with the story with Amalek, he had to do that. The people wanted, what can I do? I'm sorry. It's like, they took it, but I want to do it, like, as a sacrifice for God, blah, blah, blah. But now we see, and we spoke about that in the past, that when he really wants something, he can do that. When he feels that his throne is in danger, he doesn't hesitate at all. And he's willing to kill a whole city. Right? And we spoke about the fact that in the story of Nob, we see the same language as the story of Amalek. And we compared the two by saying over there he was hesitant, here because it was not about him specifically, it was the war commanded by God, versus when it's a direct threat to him, to his throne, he has no hesitation, no problem. Now, it's also, obviously, there's a lot of criticism about Avimelech that kills his entire family without any justice, without no trial, no nothing. And also it highlights this idea of giving, of gifting, all that stuff and benefiting his own family, just like Avimelech. So it seems that what I think the text is trying by this comparison is trying to teach us, to show, to highlight perhaps, it's the decline of Shaul. Obviously, Avimelech is the complete opposite of Shaul. But in the beginning, the Shaul that was chosen, but at the end, perhaps there's those similarities. And of course, Avimelech is the complete opposite of his father, Gidon. Remember Gidon, the judge, that he said when the offer came to become the king, the elders of Israel came to Gidon and they said, why don't you become the king? And he said to them, what? Lo emshol ani bachem, velo imshol beni bachem, Hashem imshol bachem. Nor me nor my son will be the king. Only God will rule over you. So Avimelech represents the great dangers that monarchy and kingship could cause, taking advantage of power, and we spoke about that for a long time, taking advantage of power for personal interest, harming, being cruel to those who might be an obstacle or viewed as an obstacle. No doubt that Avimelech was a negative character, look, much worse person than Shaul. But the fact that we see that comparison highlights and kind of puts it under a magnifying glass the criticism that the text has on Shaul himself. And the fact, as I mentioned, that the comparison is limited to Shaul's acts in Nov is kind of almost by itself is another highlight, or highlighting the fact that we're talking about not Shaul, the chosen king, but Shaul, the one that was a king already, was corrupted and lost his compass, his moral compass. It's the Shaul of before, the Shaul of potential versus the Shaul of after. Which brings me to what I want to talk about today also. We spoke a lot about Shaul and we analyzed this idea of power corrupts, and we talked about that and the perhaps the solution that we see in the book of Dvarim, and we talk about the founding fathers, and we talk about Plato and all that kind of stuff. And we said that power corrupts, and that's what happened to Shaul, and therefore Shaul had to be replaced. And we spoke about a lot of, we spoke a lot about psychology in the last couple of weeks, and therefore I want to do a you know, a diagnosis. I want to diagnose Shaul, and perhaps it'll help us to understand what happened. Yes, power corrupts, and that's what happened to Shaul, but let's understand something psychological. Perhaps maybe something psychological also happened here. So let's talk about paranoia for a second. Here's the definition. Paranoia is an instinct or thought process which is believed to be heavily influenced by an anxiety or fear, often to the point of delusion and irrationality. Paranoid thinking typically includes persecutory beliefs or beliefs of conspiracy concerning a perceived threat towards oneself. So basically, somebody who is paranoid have a distorted concept about reality. And that failure to understand reality or to see reality makes them makes them more suspicious, hostile perhaps, and radical behavior. Okay, somebody who's a paranoid might believe that he or she is under surveillance of all sorts of whatever organizations or whatever that is, and everybody is looking to harm him. What about narcissism or megalomania? This is a personality disorder characterized by a long-term pattern of exaggerated feelings of self-importance and excessive craving of admiration and struggles with empathy. So in this case, a person basically experiencing this power trip. He thinks that he's superior to others. Okay, and it's in its radical forms. It's harmful. Perhaps somebody who is a narcissist think that they have certain abilities that are not true, etc. And both megalomania and paranoia appears, you can find in all sorts of variety of conditions. That's not exactly my department. You can talk to Ellen later on about that. She can explain better. Bipolar disorder, etc., and others. But the idea is that both are based on delusions, fake thoughts, not reality. It's nothing to do with reality. But what's the point here? The point is that both cases, it's about me. The thought that's going on, it's about me. Okay? That means that somebody is looking for me. I'm better than somebody. It's all about me. Both sides, very different. Paranoia and megalomania are very different, but in their basis, they have something in common. It's almost like a mirror of each other. Okay, person who is a paranoid might think that somebody is chasing after him, but somebody who is a narcissist might think that God appeared to him and told him to do whatever. So in both disorders, we have this idea of, distorted, untrue, let's call it seed or idea that about my power or my importance. And both, of course, are not true. Now, back to the Torah. Chazal, in many times, tell us that in many, many places in the Torah, we have this concept of schar avera avera, meaning, or midah keneged midah. We're going to talk schar avera avera in a minute, but that the punishment is proportional or in some sort of a conjunction or relates to the act itself, to the sin. Okay? So, for example, somebody who mistreat the poor, the needy, comes actually here. Look at the black quote. כל אלמנה ויתום לא תענון, אם ענה תענה אותו כי מצאו כי צעק אליי, שמוע ישמע צעקתו, וחרה אפי והרגתי אתכם בחרב, והיו נשיכם אלמנות ובניכם יתומים. If you will treat the widow or the orphan in the wrong way, then your wives become widows and your children are going to be orphaned. Okay? You do, it's exactly midah keneged midah. Now, so the punishment of somebody who makes society a living hell is to live in such atmosphere, in such society that he himself created. And when that person take advantage and abuses the poor, the needy, then he's going to experience the same from others. Okay? And this is called by Chazal schar avera avera, meaning that the punishment for something bad is already included in the bad act itself. Okay, let's take an example. Remember the story of the spies. Okay, so the spies, they come after touring Eretz Israel and they start complaining, right? And they tell whatever, their false report, and then what we hear. I'm in the red quote. You can look at the English. Okay, everybody started kvetching because they're Jews. Oh, if we just die here in the desert, why does God bring us to all this trouble, to this terrible land? It's better already to go back to Egypt. And of course, the punishment is going to be connected, related to the complaint. Look at the green one. God says, therefore, אמור עליהם חייני נאום אדוני אם לא כאשר דיברתי באוזני כן אעשה לכם. Based on what you said, that's exactly what I'm going to do. במדבר הזה יפלו פגריכם וכל פקודיכם לכל מספרכם מבין 20 שנה ומעלה אשר עלינותם עליי. You will drop dead in this desert. אם אתם תבואו אל הארץ אשר נשאתי ידדי לשכן אתכם בה, כי אם כלב בן יפונה ביהושע בן נון, וטפכם אשר אמרתם לבז יהיה בה ויתיע אותם, וידעו את הארץ אשר מאסתם בה, ופגריכם אתם יפלו במדבר הזה. Only Caleb and Yoshua will marry to enter the land of Israel. So you are saying it's better to die in the desert? Okay, no problem. You're going to die in the desert. So the nation believes the spies that they cannot conquer the land. Right? And they say, we prefer death in the desert. And of course, God's punishment is exactly that. You're going to die in the desert. So it's exactly what we said before. Schar avera avera, meaning that the punishment of the sinner is already in the sin itself. Okay. Moving on. In Parashat Bechukotay, We see the klalot, there's all the rebuke, and there are a lot of punishments over there. And, all the horrible things that's going to happen if the nation is not going to listen, follow God's commands. But between all those diseases, wars, and the tzarot, and all the horrible things that are going to happen, there's one punishment that seems, on the surface, seems that it's not that terrible. And the Torah says that not only real troubles are going to come, but also imaginary ones. Look at the pasuk here. I'm in the top here, the black quote. ונתתי פני בכם וניגפתם לפני אויביכם, ורדו בכם שונאיכם ונסתם ואין רודף אתכם. You shall flee through non-pursuers. Meaning, you're going to be running away, but nobody is actually going to pursue you. Basically, the Torah says that if the nation is not going to follow God's commands and the ways of Hashem, going to have a case of paranoia. It's a case where somebody runs away from an imaginary enemy. And that idea comes back later on in the Parsha. Look at the green quote. והנשארים בכם והבאתים מורך בלבבם בארצות אויביהם ורדף אותם כל עלה נידף ונסו מנוסת חרב ונפלו ואין רודף. They're running away and nobody is chasing after them. וכשלו איש באחיו מפני חרב רודף עין ולא תהיה לכם תקומה לפני אויביכם. The Torah says again and again, רודף עין. There's no enemy, but still you're going to be paranoid. And they are so severe. It is so severe that radaf otam kol ale nidaf, even the smallest noise of a leaf falling going to push them over the edge. Now, here's the thing. You would think that if there's a real enemy, well, that's worse than imaginary enemy. Imaginary enemy, it's not a big deal. But the fact that the Torah goes back and highlight it as one of the worst punishments and put that actually as a pick tells us that what? This is a very, 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 very severe punishment. Paranoia is a very serious thing. Now, the question comes, why specifically paranoia? Why specifically paranoia? As we said, that the punishments over there at the end of Sefer Vayikra, those punishments are because of leaving the ways of God, not following the commandments. But we need to understand that before they're so distant from the ways of Hashem, there's let's call it some sort of a psychological process. There's something that's going on over there, something that prepares them for that. Meaning, without that preparation, without that state of mind, without that, they're not going to leave the ways of God. And what is this process? This process is described in Sefer Dvarim. This process is described in Moshe's last, so to say, speech, sermon to the people just before he dies. And we know that. And we know that text very well. Actually, Sefer Dvarim, I just want to put it in kind of like, I want to digress for a second. Maybe at some point we're going to have a chance to delve into Sefer Dvarim in depth. Sefer Dvarim is fascinating to me. It's trying to deal with the question of success, of power, both by the leader and of the nation. And how can you be successful, keep the mitzvot, keep it in the ways of Hashem, and be successful, live in a successful way in the land when you're already strong? Think about it. Moshe is standing there in Alvot Moav after 40 years, when that nation of the Jewish people already gave him hard time again and again and again in 40 years in the desert. Now he's already 120 years old. He's got his memories, he's got like all the past, he knows what was going on, but also he's very, very concerned about the future. It's a crucial point between weakness and power, between a nation of slaves and people who are going to be conquerors. Moshe, in his last speech, basically tried to warn the Jewish people from power, from corruption, from being strong. This is the vast majority of the book of Dvarim. In his last moment, Moshe is not trying to convince the people that this is their land. He knows that they're going to be victorious. God already told them that. He's not worried about that. He is concerned about the morality of the nation in the future generations. And the book is dealing with the question whether a nation can be both strong, successful, rich, wealthy, and also moral. In a way, there's a parallelism here to the narrative of the Zionist story. Unlike certain who believe that Zionism is going to corrupt the Jewish people, Moshe Rabbeinu is willing to take that risk, condition that the people are going to remember and they're going to keep a couple of crucial elements. If you remember, we talked about Plato a couple of weeks ago, but Moshe, unlike Plato, and to some extent, actually, unlike Ben-Gurion, we spoke about him also a couple of months ago, thought that what's going to keep the nation in Eretz Israel is actually the memory that that we're not from here. We're a nation of slaves that started actually in Egypt. It's not our land forever and ever. We're not from Canaan. It's the opposite. It was given to us by God. And it's conditioned. We're going to stay in the land only if we're going to keep doing the right thing. The book actually says you got to be sensitive to the foreigner, right? Gerim heyitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. You need to remember all the time that you're not from here and how much your existence in that land is fragile. Don't take it for granted. What does it depend on? It depends on what kind of society you're going to establish. People believed, and we talked about that in the past, people believed that because of the religious rituals, remember the temple, they're protected. Because of the religious practice, we have the temple. Therefore, I'm okay. I'm protected. I'm going to bring the sacrifices. Everything is going to be okay. Moshe says, absolutely not. Your protection is not going to come from those religious ceremonies. It's not going to come because of Beit HaMikdash. Lama li rov zivcheichem, right? The prophet is going to say later on. Protection is from God is going to come, what? Because of your relationship with the foreigner, with the orphan, with the widow, with the weak, with the needy, with the poor. You're going to protect those who need protection, you'll be okay. You're not going to do that, you're going to lose your protection. And all the sacrifices in the world are not going to help you. And we experienced that. Beit HaMikdash was destroyed and they went to exile. And if you remember, we talked about that religious practice has a meaning only if it's in a context, if it's not the only thing. If this becomes the only thing, meaning I can abuse the poor, the needy, the orphan, the people in the margins of society, but I'm going to be very, very, very righteous. I'm going to sacrifice. I'm going to daven 3 times a day. It's meaningless. Right? How does Moshe teaches that message? By telling them, do not forget what it used to be. Okay, Moshe does something that is called selective memory, or balancing memory, meaning he tells them what to remember, not everything. As a nation, you don't need to remember everything, every little detail. But you do have to remember the fact that you were foreigners, you were slaves, who took you out of the house of bondage, not you. Not kochi ve'otzem yadi. Not you with your own strength. It's God who took you out, who saved you. So the idea to remember that stuff, and this is why Zechirat Yetziat Mitzrayim is something that we do every day. Right? It's a positive commandment to do it every day. So you would say, well, you know, but we are a nation that we know how to remember things. I mean, right? We remember the Holocaust, we remember this, we remember Yetziat Mitzrayim, we remember, we have no problem with remembering. Problem is the fact that you were a victim of a trauma. Yes, it's not automatically going to make you a sensitive person. It could also transform you into the complete opposite. Somebody who's not going to identify with other victims. So it's not enough to remember. It depends, what do you do with that? How? What do you do with the memory? How do you do it? What do you do with that? Okay, but this is perhaps some point we're going to discuss Sefer Dvarim in depth and, you know, dive into that. Back to our topic. What is that condition? Look at the blue. Hishamar lecha. Pen tishkach et Adonai Elohecha lebel tishmor mitzvotav u'shmatav v'chukotav. You should be careful not to forget the laws and commandments of Hashem. Asher anochi mitzvavcha hayom. Pen tochal v'savata. You're going to eat. You're going to be satiated. Uvanim tovim tivneh v'yashavta. And you're going to grow. You're going to build. You're going to advance. Uvkarcha v'tzochecha yirbeinu b'chesed v'zav yirbelach. You're going to be rich, mighty, powerful. V'chol asher lach yirbeh. V'ram levavecha v'shachachta et Adonai Elohecha motziacha me'eretz Mitzrayim. Then you're going to forget your God who took you out of Mitzrayim. Took you through the desert, all the troubles of the desert. Fed you, sustained you all that time. So you're going to be able to have a good life. The problem is what? You're going to say, my own strength. I've done it. It's me. I'm so successful. I can do it. It's me. And you have to remember that it's because of God. God is the one that gave you power. God is the one that made you mighty. It's because of the covenant that God had with your fathers. It's very, very, very clear. It's not you, it's God. So, what is this dynamic that leads a person to forget God? Well, we just saw. It's wealth, it's protection, it's success. And then, Veram levavecha. It's in your heart. You start to think that it's all about you, that you've done it, you're so successful. You think that the source of all this bounty is you, it's your talents, it's your effort. It's from God. And that, the bounty, the success, the power could lead to ga'ava, could make you arrogant. And that's going to lead you to think that you can do anything. And from that, it's a very short trip way to forget God. And that idea comes again at the end, at the very end of Moshe's words in Parashat Ha'azinu, where he says the following. Look at the bottom here. חמאת בקר בחלב צאן עם חלב קרים ואלים בני בשן ועתודים עם חלב כליות חיטה ודם ענבים תשתה חמר וישמן ישורון ויבעט שמנת עבית כסית ויתוש אלוה עשהו וינבל צור ישועתי. You grew fat and gross and coarse. You also get God who made him and sprung the rock of his support. So, wealth, power, might, success could lead to arrogancy, to perhaps megalomania, narcissism. It's all about me. I'm so successful. I'm so powerful. I've done all that stuff, which leads you to leave God's ways. So forgetting God's ways connected to megalomania. And paranoia is what the Torah talks about in the curses. Now, so we said that megalomania and paranoia are connected to each other. And there's a lot of similarities between the two, because they both deal with an exaggerated measure or exaggerated dealing with oneself. It's a very fine line between the two. Between somebody who thinks that he's so important and big and successful that anyone needs to bow down to him and he can kill a whole household as Avimelech. And on the other hand, somebody who thinks that anyone wants to harm him, the paranoia. So it's this idea of everybody's thinking about me, whether it's because I have those superpowers or rather because they want to harm me. It's all about me. And which brings us a little bit to Shaul. And I think in the case of Shaul, I don't know, I'm not a licensed psychologist, but I think that we have the elements of both. Definitely we have a state of paranoia, right? Because he thinks that even the city of No, even people who were completely innocent or did the right thing, they were doing it against him to harm him specifically, especially when he is convinced that he is chased by David, which was not the case. David, in several occasions, proves to him, by the way, that he's not trying to harm him. David was able to get so close to him, and he leaves him a note. I was here when you were asleep. I could have killed you, but I didn't. So David is trying very, very hard to send that message to Saul. I'm not trying to harm you. But Shaul is because he's paranoid, he refuses to accept that. Um, is it also a case of megalomania? I don't know. I think it's more in the case of Avimelech, less in the case of Shaul. But as we saw, both are kind of connected. So let me now kind of stop that. And this is it for today.